I was going to say I had a confession to make. Now I have two confessions to make and an apology. I need to apologize to World Poverty Solutions for interrupting their video and confess that I didn't know that that was going to happen before I started speaking. And that's not unlike me. I'm a visionary and I'm very much out of touch with what's going on right here in front of me. My wife will tell you that she can't get into my head at times. I'm reminded of the time I was planning a church in the Philippines. And we had new believers, and there was an old man that had come to the Lord and was really excited about his faith. And I asked him if he could pray in one of our first church services, and he was glad to do that. And so I told him, that he was gonna go up and he was gonna pray, and then they would take the offering. Well, he went up. And he said, I'd like to ask the ushers to come forward, and the ushers came and stood. And then I'd like to ask the soloist to start to sing. And the soloist started to sing, and then he started to pray over the top of it all. And that's kind of how I felt when I started to talk here. What was coming out was not my voice, but it was this music from outer space somewhere. I have another confession to make, and that's this. When I took this assignment, I was asked to talk on a core value of holistic ministry, and one of them is participatory learning, engaging listeners as learners, helping students become researchers, not seeing people as heads with a hole in the top that we dump data into, but as thinking people who reflect and build their own concepts and worldview and then live out those actions. And I got involved in this participatory learning because I came to medical ambassadors and we were going to do Che. And so I learned from the masters. Stan, are you here? Stan Rowland? No, he is. Where is he? Over here? This is where it all began, right there. Stand up. Stan has been my mentor for 25 years. I started preaching when I was 22 years old in a church of 400 people. And I preached my way all the way through about 15 years of ministry until I got to Stan. And Stan puts everybody in a circle, and then he says to me, as a teacher, sit down. And you can't make a preacher sit down and teach. But he did. And then he said, you're not going to dump data into their heads, but we're going to facilitate a learning process. You're not going to give solutions, you're going to pose problems and invite them to create their own solutions. And I thought, that's different. That's really different. Okay. So I had to resist the impulse of getting up. By the way, it was a long time before I realized that when Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, you know what the first thing he did was? He sat down. Yes. And so I got introduced to this participatory learning and student engagement by Stan, and I started using it in Southeast Asia, and I saw lives transformed and people going out and doing things and accomplishing things that I had never seen in all my years in the pulpit. I saw movements begin to happen, and I thought to myself, this works. And so when I was asked to speak about participatory learning or student engagement or adult learning processes, however you want to talk about it, I thought to myself, well, I'm just going to have to get up there and say it works. But then I did a little bit of Google. And I don't know how I can do this all my years, but I had an aha experience, and I stand in front of you today to say that what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to ask you to adopt adult learning processes and to teach like Jesus. I hadn't been challenged to look at the processes that Jesus used in his teaching. I looked at his methods. Have you looked at his methods, right? He used stories, he used parables, he used case studies, he preached, he did miracles, he used object lessons, and all of those things were told to me in Bible college and seminary. But there's something deeper that he did that was never talked about in all of that training. And that was a process of adult learning. Have you ever wondered why a crowd would stay late into the evening to the point that they were hungry, engaged with Jesus in learning? And not just a few people, but 4,000, 5,000, 4,000 on one occasion, 5,000 on another occasion, men, and their families perhaps, were out there engaged with him. The crowds were so large that Jesus had to sit down in a boat and push out into the Sea of Galilee so that he could be heard by the crowds that had gathered. Jesus never wrote a book, but his teaching has been memorialized throughout the ages. And at the same time that he was working with multitudes that way, he would spend special time with his apostles, and he was equipping them and preparing them for an extraordinary ministry that would change the world. How many of you have been to the Sea of Galilee, to Capernaum? You get this surprise when you go there about how small this place is. This wasn't a big bustling town. These were little villages around the Sea of Galilee, and you just wonder, where did all the crowds come from that gathered? He was an extraordinary teacher, but these apostles, like Peter was a fisherman from Capernaum, and he ends up taking the gospel to Rome and converting Rome. Have you been to Rome? Right? I mean, he didn't do it himself, but he started the process there in Rome. That was a big, bustling city. How could this fisherman that had been taught on the Sea of Galilee make his way to Rome and have an impact that changed the world? All of the disciples did that. The disciples learned truth from the master teacher, but I think they also learned from the methods and the processes underneath them that he used, engaging his students as learners. And then he commanded his disciples to do the same. He said, "Go and make disciples, teaching them to observe everything that I have commanded you." And I would imagine that when these disciples went out, they not only repeated what Jesus had told them, but they imitated his methods, his process underneath it all. And I want to be careful as I start out here not to overstate the importance of our teaching methods. There were many things about Jesus that need to be taken into account, like he was divine and he could do miracles, and he rose again from the dead. And I am not here to say that we can change the world by using a different method. But I am saying, let's look at the process that Jesus used in his teaching and see what we can learn from it. An article that captured my imagination was written in September 2015 in the Journal of Catholic Education. And the title of this study was "What Jesus Can Teach Us About Student Engagement." And in the summary of their article, the authors find that Jesus modeled steps that lead to transformational learning in the context of an enduring relationship with their teacher and their peers. That sentence is just packed with meaning for those of us who teach the Che Way and have learned from Stan. It almost mimics what he has taught us. And I was surprised, actually, when I began to look at this, to see that the process that we use in our training seems to be the same process that Jesus used, and the same steps that he took in the process of learning. And so these scholars say that Jesus did 4 things. He presented a disorienting dilemma. He questioned assumptions. He called them to reflection, and then he called them to action. And I want to take these things and break them down for you a little bit at a time. A disorienting dilemma. Scholars say this about learning and learning experiences. Transformation usually begins when the learner experiences discomfort and seeks to resolve that dissonance through new insights or action. So here are a few of the disorienting dilemmas that Jesus presented. He said, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." He said, "Whoever will find his life will lose it." He said, "Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them." He said, "And if your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away." He said, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." He said, "Make a tree good and its fruit will be good, or make a tree bad and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit." He said, "Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." He said, "I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He said, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." So in all of these statements, Jesus created in the minds of his hearers a disorienting dilemma that left enough doubt and enough question for them to want to pursue it on their own. He didn't give a 3-point outline and tie it all up with an application, but instead, he challenged them to think. He didn't say, "Stop thinking." He said to them, "Stop and think." And these disorienting dilemmas were the beginning of that process. He used stories, he used parables, he used sayings, all posing problems, posing dilemmas that would challenge the hearers to become students and to engage with him. The second step that was identified by these scholars in what Jesus did was he questioned assumptions. Here's an interesting fact. In fact, let me read this to you. This comes from a guy named Copenhaver who wrote in 1954. He said, "In the Gospels, Jesus asks more questions than he answers. To be precise, Jesus asks 307 questions, and he is asked 183 questions, listen to this, of which only 3 he answered directly." Asking questions was central to Jesus' life and teaching. In fact, for every question he asks literally 100. Jesus was not the answer man, he was the question asker. And he was asking questions that created doubt in their mind and created this discomfort, maybe even anger in them, so that they would stop and think, not stop thinking. So here are some of the assumptions that Jesus questioned. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Is not life more than food, and the body more than raiment or clothing? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You have little faith. Why are you so afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves. How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, then they will fast. If any of you has a sheep that falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold and lift it out? Who is my mother and my brothers? What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you? Every one of these questions challenges assumptions in the culture and calls the people not to stop thinking, but to stop and think. The next step is reflection. And in a unique way, Jesus used the parables to call his hearers to reflect, make a decision, and act. About the parables, Dodd is one who has done probably the premier work in the area of parables and has taught us much about it. And Dodd says, the parable left in the mind sufficient doubt about its application to tease the mind into active thought. You hear that? The parable left in the mind sufficient doubt about its application to tease the mind into active thought. The parables are often open-ended, and the genius of a parable is that I can see myself in the characters without being personally threatened. So it's an invitation for me to think about controversial issues without feeling that I have been confronted. Another interesting thing about parables is that Jesus said in Matthew 13, "This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving." By posing issues, using the parables, and inviting people to write the end of the story in their own lives, people had their minds blinded in such a way that they resisted the application. They would hear the story, but they would refuse to understand it and to apply it because of assumptions that they were carrying themselves. So let's think for a minute about the story of the prodigal son. We tend to place emphasis on the prodigal, but the story was actually about the older son who stayed home. The context of the parable is this: Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with him." So the disorienting dilemma that Jesus presents in this story is the unwillingness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law to welcome sinners as their heavenly Father does. That was the disorienting dilemma. And so at the end of the story, you hear the Father saying, "My son, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Jesus did not write the ending of this story. There are many endings that could be written. We don't know if the older son boycotted the party, or if the older son attended the party, or if the older son got angry and left his father's house because his father threw a party. We don't know the end of the story. Why? Because Jesus wanted the Pharisees to write the ending of the story in their own lives and to welcome the sinners that they pushed away. You see how it works? And implied in that is a call to action. When you have to write the end of the story yourself, when you're engaged by this disorienting dilemma, and you're looking for some way to resolve it, when you find a resolution, I guarantee you're more likely to act on it. And I think that's the reason why people leave these circles of 30, where we sit for a week and we pose problems and they create solutions, and their life is transformed in the process because we're not dumping data in their heads, but we're asking them to stop and think. And we're using processes that reflect actually the processes of the master teacher. Jesus lived in a culture as far removed from ours as we can imagine. And yet his truth rings out and echoes from the ancient past into the present with remarkable clarity and relevance. The disorienting dilemmas that he used then are still disorienting today. They often contradict our worldview assumptions. Jesus challenges our individualism and our striving for self-actualization with a call to deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow him. He says, "Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Jesus challenges our materialism by asking, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Is not life more than food? He challenges our boundaries with his love and forgiveness. Peter asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister? Up to 7 times?" Jesus said, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. He challenges our hatred for oppressors with calls to love our enemy, to do good to those who hate us, and pray for those who use us. He challenges our relativism with truth. He says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." He challenges our agnosticism with his miracles. He claimed to be the resurrection and the life, and he raised Lazarus from the dead. He claimed to be the light of the world, and he healed the man born blind. He fed the 5,000, and he claimed to be the bread of life. He rebuked the wind and the waves, and he calmed the storm. In conclusion, let me present some disorienting dilemmas for you as teachers. Every one of you here is a leader and a teacher. So let me present some disorienting dilemmas to you Do our sermons compel people to stop thinking or to stop and think? Do our preferred teaching styles raise questions in the mind of hearers that leave them with enough doubt to search the scriptures themselves, think through the issue, and find answers? Do we have the courage to question cultural assumptions, knowing that such questions will make people uncomfortable and perhaps hostile? Are we willing to shatter the structures of their world and make them open to God? Are we interesting storytellers? Do we tell stories that invite hearers to see themselves in the story and compel them to write the end of the story in their own lives? Are we calling people to action or simply to come to church again next week? Are we meeting people on the streets and engaging them with real-life dilemmas? My hope and prayer is that I've raised enough questions today to challenge you to explore the teaching processes of Jesus and discover for yourselves new insights that will lead you to greater impact.